Welcome back to the Fluffy tutorial. As I promised you before, in this tutorial I'm going to show you something rather funny than really serious, which is going to be turning the molecule into something fluffy. If you're not really interested in doing a fluffy tutorial, there are some points that might be interesting for you for other purposes. So I would recommend that you follow until it starts to get hairy, and then you can just opt out. I thought incorporating the fluffy tutorial is something that you might enjoy, since it's also something that is highly requested in my normal Blender workshops as well. Good, so let's start. So the point that is important for you, even if you don't want to follow until we make our molecule fluffy, is how to separate atoms. Until now, we did not do that. That means, for example, all the carbon atoms that are linked together stay together, and we cannot modify them separately. This is just visible if I grab them, and if I move them, you see all of them move together, and we cannot ungroup them, so to say. So this is something that you might want to be interested in, and this is something we are going to start with now. To separate our atoms, we are going to go into the Atomic Blender Utilities menu again. That's the same menu that we used to change the shape of our spheres and also the size at the very beginning. I changed the shape back to something smooth. So if you think back to the tutorial that you followed before, we had the icospheres instead of the spheres. So I changed it back to the spheres. And now we are going to separate all of those objects, because we would like to modify it separately, because this is requested if we do an emitter system, which is going to be the hair afterwards. To separate atoms, the carbon atoms in that case, you are going to need to select them . There is an option available which is separate. And if you click separate, this is what's happening now. So you see the size changed again. Unfortunately, this is something we have to live with, but of course we can modify it afterwards. But now actually all our carbon atoms are freed, and they are modifiable separately from all the other atoms. So you can basically move them, and you can change their appearance without changing the appearance of every single carbon atom. If we look at the menu over there, you see now that all the carbons that are in our molecule are stored as separate objects now, and they are stored as surface objects. This is also something that we need to change in order to apply an emitter system. If you don't want to go for an emitter system, you can stay with the surface objects. It's going to be rendered nicely as the other objects are, so don't worry about that. Changing the size is something you might want to do. Unfortunately, we have to do it for all our objects separately. You just select one of the carbon atoms, go into the transform menu, and then just change the scale. I'm going to change it to something like 0.4, which is approximately the size of the other atoms. In my case, it's not overly important that I have exactly the same size, because the hair on the outside afterwards is going to create a different size anyway, so it's not overly important. So I'm going to change the size of every carbon atom now until I have all of them at the same size. Perfect. So this is what our molecule looks like now. So it's not really different from what we had before, but now we are able to modify all the atoms separately. I can also show you that in the rendered view. So you see also the material, the glossy material is still there. But for example, if I would like to have a different material applied to that specific carbon atom, I could just unlink that atom from the old material and just change the color. So let's say I would like to have a golden color there. Then you see only that atom is going to change. The other ones are going to stay the same. I'm going to change basically the material of all of those carbons to something non-glossy, just because it's easier for me to show you what the render results are going to be. So I'm going to use a diffuse shader, and I'm going to make it a bit darker. That also helps seeing what's happening here. Perfect. So there is one last step that we have to do before we are going to insert the hairs, basically, or insert the emitter system. And this is, we need to convert the objects that are surfaces now into a mesh. This is required because there cannot be an emitter system from a surface. It needs to be a mesh. But also the conversion of that kind is actually quite simple. So you just select the object, you go to object, and then you say convert to, and you say mesh from curve, meta, surface, or text. And as soon as you do that, the shape does not change, that's fine, but you see that the icon in the front of the object basically changes. So it goes from surface to mesh. And that's something you have to do for all of the objects as well. Selecting it, going to object, convert to mesh from curve. So all our carbon atoms are meshes now, and they are ready to be used as an emitter system. I'm going to show you how to do that by just using one of the atoms. Emitter systems can be quite harsh on your computer as well, so it might be that you experience severe lacking. To prevent that, we are going to stay mainly in the solid mode rather than the rendered mode, and I'm just going to switch to the rendered mode a couple of times to see how it looks like. Also, if we would do the same emitter system simultaneously on all of the atoms, that for sure is going to cause severe lacking. So we would like to avoid that. Good, so then select one of the atoms where you would like to set up the emitter system that is later on going to apply to all of the carbon atoms. And then there is a new menu appearing here, which is the particle properties. And this is where we set up an emitter. So if you hit that one and press the little plus, you see that there is a particle system added now. There are two types of systems available. There is an emitter or there is a hair system, and we would like to go for hair. So as soon as I click on hair, you also see that there is already some hair appearing. There's a lot of hair appearing and it's super long. That of course is way too long for us. So we are going to change the first parameter, which is the hair length. There you can go down to whatever value you like. And this is again totally up to you. I'm going to stay with something like, let's see, 0.08. That fits perfectly in my scene. I don't want the hair to be overly long because otherwise the spheres with the hair would touch each other, which is not a huge issue because we can make the spheres smaller, then also the hair is going to get shorter a bit. But for now, I'm going to keep it at that. So maybe we are going to do some fine tuning afterwards. Then I also would like to have more hair. I'm going to go into that section here where I can increase the number, and I'm going to use something like 5,000. So you see that looks already quite nice, but it's not really looking like something fluffy. It really looks like a hedgehog with a geometrical alignment of its spikes. So that does not really look natural. And I can also switch to the rendered mode quickly so that you see what it looks there. What we would like to have is a smoother way of displaying the hair, and of course we would like to have more. And hair is always affected by gravity, and this is also something we are going to simulate basically. To have that options available, we are just going to click the hair dynamics, and immediately you see that the hair is basically changing its shape. So you see that there are a couple of strands that start to hang, and this is what I mentioned before. That's basically the effect of gravity on the hair. To get more hair, we could increase the number of hair, but this is something that's also very harsh on your computer again. I would rather recommend going for adding more children. That means one hair strand gets a random assortment of child hair, which on the one hand makes it more realistic, on the other hand it's not that harsh on your computer. So instead of having none, you can just simply click on simple children, and then you see we already have something quite fluffy. It still looks a bit weird, but this is something we are going to modify now. As I said before, the hair is affected by gravity. Particle systems are something dynamic. That also means also the particles or the systems are affected by gravity. Something I did not talk until now is actually the lower part in your window, which shows you that play, stop buttons and so on and so forth, where you can play animations. And this is what we are going to do now. What we are going to do is first of all switch to the first frame that we have here. And then if you just hit play, you're going to see how your hair starts basically to behave if there was gravity involved. And there are large parts that actually start to hang down, and they are affected by gravity. And this is exactly what we would like to have. So if I go back into the rendered mode, you see that there are single strands that are appearing and they are starting to hang down. And this is already something quite fluffy. And I would say also the amount of hair that are shown as children is actually really sufficient. You need to be a bit careful though. When you activate the children, you have two numbers basically that you can change. First of all, the amount of hair or children that is actually displayed, and then the amount which is rendered afterwards. So you see that the amount that is rendered afterwards is 100 and there are only 10 displayed. So your final render, if those numbers are different, might look also totally different what you see now. So it's recommended to check at least once how your final rendering is going to look like with the same amount of numbers here. So I think 100 in our case is way too much. So I'm going to try with 20. Let's see how that looks like. That means I'm just going to adjust both of those numbers and enter the rendered preview once to see how our final rendering with the fluffy molecules would look like. And I think actually 20 children are totally fine. So this is enough. We don't need to have more of them. Depending on how the hair looks, there are also a couple of options that you can choose from. For example, if you would like to have a random size. So normally hair is not every hair is equally long. So we can add a random size here as well. Or a random radius. I'm not going to change much here because I think it already really looks nice that way. That we have it now. Just that you know, you can have some kind of clumps so that not every hair is basically generated at the same point of your sphere. So you can have clumps. And by just changing the numbers here, you also see how the hair basically changes. I'm going to add a little bit of clumping so that it looks a bit more real. You can also have some kind of twist so that you see it's like twisting around your emitter object, or you can have some kind of roughness, and there is also an option where you can add a kink. A kink is just something like a spiral, a braid, a wave. Just be careful. If you have really short hair, you also need very small numbers basically of that kink. So the length should be really small, otherwise it affects a lot of your of the hair that you find here. But I'm not going to add any kink, so I'm going to leave it like this. And I'm actually quite happy with the way the hair looks like and also with the way it falls. If you would like to have very fine hair, so that also means you need more hair to make it fluffy, you can also change the shape of your hair. So you see that there is a radius for the root and there is a radius for the tip, and the tip is normally really small, so it gets smaller to the tip. But if you also change the radius, make that one smaller, then also your hair gets finer and it looks even more fluffy. But also this is something I'm not going to change here. Great. So we basically set up the emitter for one of our atoms. It looks like actually that the shape is a bit too large. So you see that it's nearly already touching the neighboring atoms, and it's basically nearly hiding the bonds completely. So I think we should go down to let's try 0.3 concerning the size. And also I'm going to go for solid. If nothing changes, be sure to set back your mark of the frames to 1 again, because then it changes to the default setting. But then, of course, you need to do the simulation again. And in this case, I'm just going to leave it until the same frame that we had before. That was around 17, 18. And that's basically it. Now I think the size actually looks nice. If you would like to go back a bit, you can also navigate back in your times frame. So I think I go back to 12 probably. But then of course I would like to have the same effect on all of my carbon atoms now, not only one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give that particle system a name. I'm just going to name it here. That's fine. And then I just select one of the other carbon atoms. I'm going to add a new particle system and I'm going to select the hair system. Then of course we have to do the simulation again so that the hair falls down basically, but this is not a problem, so we can do that in the end. Now we have to do the same thing with all the carbon atoms, and the good thing is that also in this case when we do a modification to the particle system, it's going to affect, oops, that's the one that has it already, it's going to affect all of our, where is the last one? Ah, there it is. It's going to affect all of our carbons because it's the same system for all of the carbons. There are weird artifacts that sometimes appear. So you see there are some hairs that are a bit longer than the other ones. That comes from the fact that they're at that area of the sphere, there seems to be some mismatched vertices or something. It does not matter overly much because the hair is going to fall down, so it's not visible anymore. If this is something that is disturbing you, you could also change where the hair basically is emitted from. Now it's emitted from faces. You can go to volume or vertices basically. And if you go to volume, I think it disappears. But then, of course, you have to make your hair a bit longer again because it starts to grow from the middle of your object. So that might be a solution. There you have to play around with it a little bit. I'm not really worried about it too much because I know that it's going to fall down anyway and it's not going to be visible. So I'm going to reset my player to the end point, and now I'm going to do the simulation until approximately frame number 12. But before we do that, I should rescale actually all of my carbons. I forgot to rescale the other ones, so I'm going to make all of them a bit smaller. The last one. Perfect. So all of them should have the same size now. Perfect. And then I'm just going to jump back to the first frame and I'm going to hit play. And now what happens is that you see your computer needs to calculate actually a lot. So you see that the frames are moving very slowly. That's because it has to calculate all the single hair systems basically. I'm going to stop around frame number 12 because I like how the hair basically looks here, and this would be the image for the final render afterwards. I'm going to do a tiny modification in terms of the looks. So I'm going to go into the rendered mode again because I don't like to have like dark fluffy hair. So I would like to have some kind of pastel colors for that, to be honest. So if something is fluffy, it can be pastel colored all the way through. So I'm going to use a very light color. Probably I'm going to go with a light purple. And I'm also going to give the nitrogen a bit of a more pastel-y color rather than the very dark blue. And I'm going to do the same for the oxygen. Let's see how that looks like. That looks perfectly cheesy. I'm going to stay with that. I'm going to render that scene now, and we are going to meet each other again when the rendering is done. So this is the final outcome. I have to admit it actually took a bit longer to render that image because I cranked up the sample number. But this is the final outcome. I think our fluffy molecule looks actually really good. Of course, if you want, you can make all of our atoms fluffy. So this is up to you. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial as well. If you don't like the fluff, keep in mind that there are other useful tips like separating atoms or highlighting atoms by separation in the tutorial as well. You don't need to make pastelly fluffy molecules. It's fine if you just remember all the other tips. If you enjoyed the fluff as much as I do, I'm happy to hear that as well. So have fun with making all your future Blender projects fluffy and pastelly, and I'm going to see you in the next tutorial.